Elena Martinez sat on the worn wooden porch of her ranch house, the weight of years pressing on her shoulders as she cradled a steaming cup of coffee between her calloused hands. The setting Texas sun cast a golden hue across the vast expanse of land she and her late husband had built together, its warm glow stretching long shadows across the open fields. The quiet should have been comforting, but tonight it felt different. Too still, too fragile, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Beside her, Kaiser lay motionless, ears erect, dark amber eyes scanning the horizon with an intensity that mirrored her own unease. The German Shepherd was more than just a companion. He was an extension of her instincts, a living, breathing safeguard forged from years of training and an unbreakable bond. His presence had always reassured her, yet tonight, even he seemed unusually alert, muscles coiled beneath his sleek coat, ready to spring into action at the slightest disturbance. Elena took a slow sip of coffee, allowing its bitter warmth to settle the cold dread creeping into her chest. She had spent 30 years trying to leave the past behind, but the past had never truly left her. The ghosts of old battles, of faces long gone, some imprisoned, some dead, still haunted her in the quiet moments. And now she could feel it in her bones. The past was coming back. A gust of wind rustled the dry grass at the edge of the property, a sound so ordinary that most wouldn't have given it a second thought. But Elena did. She always did. Instinct had kept her alive during her years as a DEA agent, and that instinct whispered now, as clear as it ever had. Something was off. She glanced down at Kaiser. The dog hadn't moved, but his ears had flicked ever so slightly, his breathing shifting. He had sensed it too. Elena exhaled slowly, her grip tightening around the ceramic mug. It had started 3 days ago, a subtle shift in the air around her, an unseen presence lurking at the edges of her awareness. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. First, it was the out-of-place footprints near the back fence, too fresh, too deep, as if someone had been watching, waiting. Then, the truck she had seen twice in town, parked a little too long at the diner, the driver's gaze lingering on her reflection in the window. And then, this morning, a stranger had come to the ranch. He had arrived dressed as a utility worker, a clipboard in hand, his demeanor casual, almost too friendly. He claimed to be checking water lines, but when Elena asked for identification, he hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty before he recovered, producing a badge she knew damn well wasn't real. She had let him look around, watching his every move from the porch, Kaiser at her side, a silent warning. The man had lingered by the barn, scanning the area as though committing it to memory. When he finally left, his gaze met hers, and something unspoken passed between them. It was a look she had seen before. The look of a predator sizing up its prey. Elena had spent decades chasing men like him, men who thought they were untouchable, and now one of them had come knocking at her door. She set the coffee down on the small table beside her, the gentle clink of ceramic against wood lost in the growing tension that thickened the air. Her gaze swept across the land, tracing the well-worn paths she knew by heart, the fences she had mended, the barn where she had once watched her grandson learn to ride. This was her home, and someone was coming to take it from her. Slowly, she leaned down, running her fingers through Kaiser's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. The dog turned his head, meeting her eyes, his silent question clear. Not yet, but soon. The night air was thick with silence, the kind that carried a weight of anticipation, pressing down on the land like an omen. The moon hung high, casting a silver sheen over the Texas plains, stretching long shadows across the ground. At the heart of it all stood Elena Martinez's farmhouse, sturdy and defiant, much like the woman inside it. She sat at her kitchen table, meticulously cleaning Miguel's old revolver, her hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The weapon had long been retired, but tonight it felt like an extension of herself, a necessary relic from a past she had tried to bury. Kaiser lay at her feet, his ears twitching at every distant rustle, his body tense with an unspoken understanding. He sensed it too. Something was coming. Elena didn't need confirmation. She had known for days. The men in the black SUV had been asking questions in town, too many questions, and too specific to be random curiosity. The so-called utility worker hadn't come for water inspections. He had come to scout. Every instinct she had honed over decades screamed the same truth. They were closing in. She reached for her coffee, now cold, but before the cup reached her lips, Kaiser's head shot up. His ears perked, his body coiling like a loaded spring. He had heard something, something beyond the usual creaks of an old house or the night sounds of the countryside. Elena froze. Then she heard it too, a faint crunch of gravel, the kind of sound that came from a cautious footstep, not an animal, not the wind. Someone was out there. Slowly, she set the coffee down and moved toward the light switch, flipping it off with practiced precision. Instantly, darkness swallowed the room. Years of training kicked in as she moved silently through the house, her pulse steady, her breathing controlled. She grabbed Miguel's revolver from the table and slipped it into the waistband of her jeans, then crouched near the front window. Through the sheer curtains, she could see them, shadows shifting at the edge of her property. 5, maybe 6. Armed. Moving with purpose. Not amateurs. They knew what they were doing. They had cut the power. Smart. They had blocked the main road with an unmarked vehicle. Even smarter, this wasn't an act of intimidation. It was a coordinated attack, a hit. And she was the target. Elena's jaw clenched. So, this was how it was going to be. After all these years, after everything she had done to build a quiet life, they had come to settle an old score. She should have known better than to believe the past would stay buried. Kaiser let out a low, guttural growl, the kind that sent a primal shiver down the spine. His hackles rose, his body shifting into position. He was waiting for her command. Not yet. She needed to know their plan first. The men moved toward the house, their silhouettes barely visible against the night. One of them gestured toward the back door. 2 split off, moving swiftly in that direction. The others advanced toward the front, weapons drawn. Elena took a slow breath. They thought she was just an old woman living alone, a loose end to be tied up. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She pressed her back against the wall, her mind racing. The farmhouse was old, but its structure gave her an advantage. Thick walls, narrow entry points. She had spent years learning to read a battlefield, and tonight, this house was hers. A sudden knock at the front door shattered the silence. Not a polite knock, a warning. Elena Martinez, a voice called out, smooth but edged with malice. We don't want to drag this out. Make it easy on yourself. She didn't respond. Another knock, louder, a pause. Then the back door handle rattled. They were testing her. She tightened her grip on the revolver. The men outside had come expecting an easy kill, a frail woman caught off guard. What they were about to walk into was something else entirely. They had made a mistake, and in the next few moments, they were going to realize just how big of one. The moment the first man stepped through the back door, he knew something was wrong. The farmhouse was dark, too dark, and silent in a way that sent a chill down his spine. His training told him this should have been an easy job, an old woman isolated and alone. A clean hit. But the air inside was thick with something else, a trap. Before he could turn to signal his partners, a guttural snarl cut through the silence. Then, chaos erupted. Kaiser struck like a shadow tearing through the night, 110 pounds of pure muscle and instinct. The man barely had time to scream before powerful jaws locked onto his forearm, teeth sinking deep. The force sent him crashing into the kitchen table, knocking over a chair. His gun clattered to the floor. "Get him off me!" he shrieked, struggling, but Kaiser was relentless. The second man raised his weapon, but before he could fire, a single gunshot echoed through the house. A bullet tore through his shoulder. He staggered back, cursing, as Elena emerged from the shadows, her revolver steady in her hands. "Drop it," she ordered, her voice like steel. The wounded man hesitated, his breath ragged, before finally letting his gun fall to the wooden floor. Outside, the others had heard the shot. A voice barked orders in Spanish, and within seconds, footsteps pounded toward the front door. The moment they kicked it in, Elena was ready. She had positioned herself behind the solid oak dining table, using the furniture as cover. The first man through the door fired blindly into the dark, his gun flashing with each shot. Elena didn't flinch. She had been in shootouts before. She knew the mistakes amateurs made. Staying low, she moved fast, firing off 2 shots. The first missed, too close, too fast. The second didn't. The bullet struck the intruder in the thigh, sending him crashing into the doorway with a guttural grunt of pain. The others hesitated. Elena used that hesitation. With a practiced motion, she overturned the table, sending it toppling onto its side to block their path. Then she shouted, loud and clear, "I already called the sheriff! You have 2 minutes before this place is crawling with law enforcement." A lie, but an effective one. One of the intruders cursed under his breath. They hadn't expected a fight. They had come thinking they'd be cleaning up an old debt, not walking into a war zone. Elena Martinez, a voice called from outside. It was the leader, smooth, calm, but laced with irritation. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." She didn't answer. Instead, she flicked her eyes toward Kaiser. He understood. Releasing his first victim, the German shepherd moved like a ghost toward the shattered front door, his paws silent against the hardwood. Outside, 3 men were regrouping, scanning the porch, searching for movement. Too late. Kaiser lunged. He hit the nearest man at full speed, sending him crashing into the porch railing with a sickening thud. The man screamed, trying to shake the dog off, but Kaiser had latched onto his leg this time, refusing to let go. The leader cursed. "Fall back!" But their retreat was already too slow. In the distance, sirens wailed. The sheriff hadn't actually been called, but the border patrol unit stationed nearby had heard the shots. Panic set in among the remaining cartel soldiers. The second-to-last man took off running into the dark, disappearing into the fields. The leader, now alone, glared at the farmhouse. This was supposed to be simple. Instead, he had lost men. His mission had failed. And Elena Martinez was still alive. "We're not done," he spat toward the house before turning and vanishing into the night. Inside, Elena exhaled slowly. Her hands weren't shaking. Her heart was steady. The fight was over, but she knew better than to think it was finished. She holstered Miguel's revolver and looked down at Kaiser, who panted beside her, his ears still alert. She knelt beside him, running a hand through his thick fur. "Good boy," she whispered. Outside, the blue and red lights of patrol vehicles cut through the night, illuminating the remnants of a battle that had been decades in the making. The war wasn't over, but tonight, the farm had been defended, and Elena Martinez was still standing. Elena Martinez sat at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee, her mind racing. The farmhouse was quiet now, but the tension in the air was thick, pressing down on her like the Texas heat. Kaiser lay at her feet, his ears twitching at every distant sound. He sensed it too. The storm was far from over. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up, eyes narrowing at the unknown number. "Some debts can only be paid in blood. See you soon, Vieja." Diego Vargas. Elena's grip on the phone tightened. He had her secure number. That meant there was a leak, someone on the inside feeding him information. She forwarded the message to Anthony and Agent Ramirez, then powered the phone down. There was no point in losing sleep over what she already knew. Diego wasn't done. He had lost the battle at the farm, but he was regrouping, planning, and next time, he wouldn't underestimate her. By morning, the farm was crawling with law enforcement. Anthony arrived first, his expression dark as he stormed into the kitchen. "How the hell did he get your number?" he demanded. Elena took a slow sip of her coffee. "That's the question, isn't it?" Agent Ramirez entered behind him, already scrolling through data on her tablet. "We've identified a breach in the secure comms network. It's subtle, but someone has been feeding Diego bits of intelligence, likely hoping we wouldn't notice. This message confirms our suspicions." "Do we know how much he knows?" Anthony asked. James Wilson, Elena's former DEA handler, stepped forward. "Not enough to compromise the entire operation, or he wouldn't have wasted time taunting her. This is psychological warfare. He wants her rattled." Elena smirked. "He'll have to try harder than that." Sheriff David leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "We're adjusting security measures, changing protocols, no more unsecured communication. We keep the final details of the operation on a need-to-know basis. But we also need to consider something else. Diego might not stick to our script." Elena nodded. "He knows we're expecting him at the farmer's market, which means he could hit the farm again or attack while I'm in transit." "Exactly," Anthony said. "We need contingency plans." Ramirez pulled up a satellite map of the area, outlining new security reinforcements along the farm's perimeter. "We're doubling the personnel here, installing additional surveillance. More Plains agents will be stationed along the road to Mesa Verde, covering possible ambush points." James cleared his throat. Elena, you're sure you still want to go through with this? You don't have to be the bait. Elena set her coffee down with a deliberate motion. If we don't control the situation, he will. This is my home, James. If he thinks he can drive me out, he's wrong. Anthony exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. Then we make sure this plan is airtight. By midday, the final details were locked in. Security along the farmers' market route was tightened, with additional personnel stationed at critical points. The farm was reinforced with extra surveillance, and Anthony had even called in a favor, deploying thermal imaging drones to monitor the area overnight. The sun was dipping low when Elena and Kaiser took their usual evening walk along the property line. The farm felt different now. It wasn't just home, it was a battleground. And she wasn't just a retired DEA agent tending her land, she was a target. As they neared the barn, Kaiser suddenly stopped. His ears perked, his body went rigid. Elena's pulse quickened. She followed his gaze, scanning the tall grass along the fence line. A boot print, fresh. Someone had been here. Her fingers curled around the revolver at her hip. Slowly, she backed toward the house, keeping her eyes on the field. Kaiser stayed close, his muscles taut, ready. By the time she reached the porch, she already knew. Diego had people watching her. The game had already begun. The wheels of the SUV spun against the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust as it tore through the dense Texas countryside. Diego Vargas sat in the front passenger seat, gripping the door handle, his jaw clenched in frustration. His plan had crumbled before his eyes. What was meant to be a clean escape had turned into a desperate flight. In the back seat, his two remaining men exchanged tense glances, their weapons ready. The forested backroads weren't supposed to be an issue, but now law enforcement was closing in. The makeshift roadblocks had forced them off the main highway, pushing them deeper into unfamiliar terrain. Diego turned to the driver. Faster! We can't risk it, the man shot back, swerving around a fallen tree. These roads aren't built for speed. If we flip, we're finished. Diego let out a sharp breath, glancing at the side mirror. Flashing lights glowed in the distance, with Fofri drawing closer. Behind them, Elena Martinez sat in the passenger seat of a tactical vehicle, gripping the door's handle as Anthony drove with expert precision. The convoy had split to cut off Diego's routes, but she knew this wasn't just about a chase. This was about ending it. Do not lose them, she told Anthony, her voice calm but edged with steel. Wasn't planning on it, he muttered, shifting gears and pushing the accelerator harder. Kaiser, seated behind them, stayed tense, his ears flicking at every sudden movement. He knew something was happening, something big. Ahead, Diego's SUV took a sharp turn onto an old logging road, the tires skidding dangerously. One of his men cursed, grabbing onto the dashboard. They were losing control. We need to ditch the car, the driver growled. Diego scanned the surroundings, his mind racing. Then he saw it, the old hunting cabin tucked between the trees, isolated, a temporary sanctuary. There, he ordered. Pull in. The SUV lurched onto the overgrown path, crashing through low-hanging branches before coming to a stop just yards from the cabin. Diego was out first, weapon drawn. His men followed, sprinting toward the building. Back on the road, Elena and Anthony spotted the shift. They're making a move, Anthony said, steering hard onto the same path. Elena was already reaching for the radio. All units, they've gone off-road, abandoned vehicle spotted. Converge on my coordinates. The tactical SUV screeched to a stop near Diego's vehicle. Anthony was out in seconds, weapon ready. Kaiser leapt from the back seat, landing gracefully, ears up, nose in the air. Elena moved with precision, her years of experience taking over. She spotted the faint movement through the trees, the cabin. They're inside, she said. They won't come quietly. A crackle came through Anthony's radio. Backup is 2 minutes out. Orders? Elena glanced toward the cabin. We don't give them 2 minutes. Anthony hesitated, but he knew she was right. Every second Diego had was another chance to escape. He nodded. Let's end this. Moving low, they advanced toward the cabin. Kaiser took point, his body moving like liquid shadow against the moonlight. His breath was steady, his instincts sharp. Inside, Diego peered through a crack in the wooden slats. They're coming. Then we take them first, his man whispered, raising his rifle toward the door. A mistake. A growl erupted from the darkness, then a blur of black and tan. Kaiser moved with lethal efficiency, lunging at the armed man before he could react. The impact sent the rifle clattering to the floor as the enforcer screamed, struggling against the crushing force of Kaiser's bite. Diego turned, weapon raised, but before he could fire, Elena's voice rang out. "Drop it, Diego!" He hesitated, eyes locking with hers. "You don't walk away from this," she continued. "Your father didn't, neither will you." A moment passed, a flicker of defiance, of calculation. Then the back door burst open as tactical agents swarmed in, weapons drawn. Diego Vargas had run out of time. As he was forced to the ground, handcuffs clicking shut, Elena exhaled, the weight of 30 years finally lifting. Justice had come full circle. The sun was beginning to set over Willow Creek Farm, casting long shadows across the land that had stood as a quiet sanctuary for decades. But tonight, it was anything but quiet. The tactical vehicles lined the dirt driveway, their engines humming as agents moved about, securing the area. Diego Vargas, hands cuffed behind his back, was led toward one of the armored SUVs. His face was bruised, his once impeccable suit now dirt-streaked and torn. Elena Martinez stood on the porch, watching him go. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a deep, weary understanding that justice, no matter how long delayed, always had its day. Diego glanced up, locking eyes with her. Even now, in defeat, there was something in his gaze. Pride, anger, maybe even a trace of respect. "You think this is over, Senora?" he said, his voice rough but steady. "Families don't forget." Elena didn't flinch. She took a slow step forward, her hand resting lightly on Kaiser's head. The German Shepherd stood rigid beside her, his golden eyes never leaving Diego. "Neither do I," she replied evenly. "Your father thought the same way. Look where it got him." A flicker of something crossed Diego's face, perhaps the realization that his fate was now mirroring his father's. Then, without another word, he was pushed into the back of the SUV, the door slamming shut behind him. Anthony approached, his face lined with exhaustion. "They're taking him to a secure facility 2 hours from here. He won't be seeing the outside world anytime soon." Elena nodded, glancing back at the house. The damage was extensive. The east porch had partially collapsed from the explosion, windows were shattered, and bullet holes scarred the wooden walls. Inside, the kitchen bore the remnants of smoke damage, a bitter reminder of the night's events. "Come inside," Anthony urged. "You need to rest." But Elena shook her head. "Not yet." She stepped down from the porch, walking slowly toward the front of the property. The night air was crisp, carrying the lingering scent of burnt wood and gunpowder. Kaiser followed closely, his body still tense, ears twitching at every distant sound. As she reached the main gate, she paused. Beyond the fields, the land stretched endlessly toward the horizon, bathed in the dying light of the sun. This was her home, the place she and Miguel had built together, where they had raised their family. Diego Vargas had come to take it from her, to erase the life she had fought for. But he had failed. She turned back toward the house, her resolve settling into something unshakable. The Vargas cartel had underestimated her once. They would not do so again. The next morning, the chaos had quieted. The tactical teams had withdrawn, leaving only a few agents to monitor the property. Repairs had already begun, wood being measured for the broken porch, new panes of glass stacked against the wall, waiting to replace shattered windows. Anthony stood by the truck, speaking into his secure phone. When he hung up, he exhaled heavily. "Diego's talking," he announced. "He's giving up names, routes, operations, everything." Elena arched a brow. "That was fast." "The idea of a life sentence tends to change a man's priorities," Anthony admitted. She considered that for a moment, then simply nodded. Justice, even in the hands of men like Diego Vargas, had a way of working itself out. "You're still going to the market this weekend, aren't you?" Anthony asked after a pause. Elena turned to him, a slow smile forming. "Of course." Anthony laughed, shaking his head. "You just survived an armed cartel assault, and your biggest concern is selling eggs and vegetables?" "It's not just about that," she said. "It's about standing my ground, about showing them, and everyone else, that fear won't drive me away from my own life." Anthony looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then I guess we'll be there too." That Saturday, as the morning sun rose over the farmer's market, Alina stood at her stall, arranging fresh produce as if nothing had changed. But something had. The people in town had heard what happened. They looked at her differently now, not as an old woman selling vegetables, but as the woman who had stood toe-to-toe with a cartel and won. And at her side, Kaiser sat tall, watching over everything. The war wasn't over, but today, they had won. And that was enough. In the end, this story is more than just a tale of justice and survival. It is a testament to the bond between humans and the natural world. Kaiser was not just a guard dog, he was a protector, a friend, and a reminder that loyalty transcends words. His unwavering dedication to Alina proved that animals, when treated with love and respect, will stand by our side through the darkest of times. Nature, too, played its part. The farm was more than just land. It was a living legacy, a place of peace that stood resilient, even in the face of destruction. It is a reminder that we must cherish and protect the world around us, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. In a world where violence and greed threaten so much of what is good, perhaps the greatest lesson is this: true strength does not come from power or weapons, but from the bonds we build with those who trust us, both human and animal alike. If we care for them, they will stand with us, just as Kaiser did. So let us protect them in return, honoring their loyalty by safeguarding the natural world and all its creatures.